I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello, and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. In 2019, Algeria experienced a period of significant change with the ousting of long-term President Abdelmadjid Bouteflika amid intense protests helmed by the Hirak movement, which later called for social and economic reform. Later that year, Abdelmadjid Tebboune was elected president. This year marks the end of Tebboune's 5-year term as he runs for a second-term re-election, having called early elections in March. Here to discuss what Tebboune has accomplished during his first term and what we can expect from a likely re-election is RANE's Middle East and North Africa analyst, Kristin Ronzi. Hi, Kristin.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Can you start by providing a bit of background information regarding the candidates and polling for the upcoming September 7th election?
Absolutely. So 3 candidates have been validated by Algeria's election committee to be able to run in the September 7th election. In Algeria, there is a 2-round election system, so if there's not a clear victor with a majority of votes after the September 7th voting, we'll likely see a second round of elections. So the 3 candidates include incumbent President Abdelmadjid Tebboune and 2 additional candidates. And these candidates have been validated and they have met all the requirements in order to run for election, but several of the candidates did not meet the criteria, and that includes getting a certain number of signatures from either electors or among the population as well. So there has been some controversy among those who have been eligible to run in this election. This is an early election, so this was called a few months ahead of schedule. Even now, we still don't know the clear reason behind why this was called a couple months in advance. But as you mentioned in the introduction, this was called by Tebboune in March of this year, and this is something that the Constitution allows him to do. As a result, he has the backing of several key political parties, including the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, in Algeria, and several other of its coalition partners. And so as a result, along with the backing of the military, we're very likely to see Tebboune get a re-election victory this year. Just for context, in his first run in December of 2019, he won in the first round of elections with about a 58% victory. So it's possible that we'll see a similar margin this time around. One of the concerns, though, that the Algerian government is experiencing is potential lack of voter turnout ahead of these elections. There's been some political disenchantment, especially after the momentum that was in 2019 that saw the ousting of Bouteflika and then the subsequent December 2019 election of Tebboune. But there hasn't necessarily been substantial social and economic reform, so some of those individuals that were pushing for reform at the time may not be as politically engaged this time around.
What are some of the key considerations and factors that you're watching ahead of these elections?
So one of the things to note about these elections, and something to monitor about Algeria more broadly, is the shifting demographics. So around 50% of the population in Algeria is very young, and previously the FLN, which backs Tebboune, got a lot of support from individuals who had lived through Algeria's independence movement, and this was something that a lot of the individuals who had led the independence movement were part of the FLN, and that was sort of a natural trajectory for some of these Algerian political elites. That tendency is no longer as relevant for some of the youth voters, and instead some of these larger concerns regarding social and economic issues are driving political involvement or disengagement for some of these youth. Additionally, one of the things that's in the background of this election is France's acknowledgement of Morocco's sovereignty claims over Western Sahara. This has been a very salient political issue between Morocco and Algeria, and we're likely to see a lot of nationalist rhetoric among Algerian politicians at this time to rile up some support. However, even with this nationalist movement, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a substantial change, both in Algeria's foreign policy and its broader stance on Western Sahara, but this is something that's probably going to be noted in some of the rhetoric that we'll see. And furthermore, there are some persistent economic problems that are going to be weighing on especially the youth voters. Youth unemployment rate in Algeria is quite high. In July 2024, it was around 31%. And because youth make up such a large proportion of Algeria's population, this is going to probably weigh heavily on the election. There's also just growing disenchantment for the political process in Algeria. Many of these young voters cannot feel reflected among some of Algeria's political elites who have been in power and been quite influential in the political sphere for several decades, some of them. And so as a result, there's a disconnect between what some of these candidates are saying as well as some of the younger voters. So as a result, there's a concern, especially among Algiers, that there will be a low political turnout for the vote. And even if Tebboune is reelected, with a low voter turnout, kind of will demonstrate a lack of broader political support within the population of his administration.
So given the negative feelings amongst the youth for Tebboune's administration, if he does win re-election, what changes can we expect in a second term for him?
So there may be some movement to make some social and economic concessions, but these would probably be on the smaller scale. There was wider spread calls for substantial reform back in 2019 to 2021, but those have largely dissipated with the dissolution of the Hirak movement, due in large part to the COVID-19 pandemic that made it very difficult for them to organize. So we've seen some reforms, but with Algeria's reliance on oil and gas for a large part of its economy, and because we've seen Algeria benefit from the shift in the hydrocarbon industry with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there's not necessarily going to be a short-term pressure on Algeria to make some of these substantial reforms that it needs in order to achieve medium growth. And this is a tension that we see within Algeria. There have been movements throughout Tebboune's first term presidency to make some reforms to enable foreign investment to increase in Algeria, especially in non-essential sectors. So some of the reform efforts that we've seen in order to liberalize the economy and open it up a little bit more to foreign investment include the 2019 hydrocarbon law, which eased foreign investment in the oil and gas sectors, in addition to the removal of Algeria's 5149 ownership regulations for non-strategic sectors. So this was one of the major barriers for foreign investment because it required at the time a 51% ownership from Algerian entities, and for non-strategic sectors this has decreased. So it's possible that we'll see some of these additional reforms in similar fashion that ease impediments to foreign investment, especially non-strategic sectors, but Algeria will likely try to heavily protect its oil and gas industries because they do play such a critical role, not only for their national security interests, but also for their economy. One of the challenges, though, that the Algerian economy is facing is it does not enable foreign borrowing, which would finance some larger structural reforms. As a result, there is significant political pushback, including from Tebboune, which is called foreign borrowing political suicide. And in the absence of such, it's unable to make the substantial economic reforms that youth voters are calling for. One additional thing that we're likely to see is that Algeria's gross debt to GDP ratio will likely increase. In 2024, it was around 58.8%. Algeria's high gross debt to GDP ratio will force the government to finance the budget deficit through local debt issuance and draw down its sovereign wealth fund, which could lead to increased inflation in Algeria in a longer term and further stress the economy for some of these individuals that are feeling an economic crunch.
With all the dissatisfaction with the government, are we likely to see social unrest or any political backlash?
So the grievances that led to the Hirak movement earlier are still there, but because of COVID-19 pandemic, the group has no longer really been able to organize in such a manner, and it's very difficult to resurrect such a large movement. So we may see some localized protests, especially if the Algerian economy worsens quite significantly under the second term of Tebboune. But these protests would likely argue for concessions, including anti-corruption measures, transparency from the military, improved social benefits, and the like. And so as a result, the Algerian government may make some of these smaller concessions to appease the protesters if that were to happen. It's very unlikely, though, that we would see the large-scale protests of 2019 that could potentially destabilize the Algerian political sphere. And as a result, we're likely to see these sort of smaller patterns of concessions from the central government. An additional thing to note is that the Algerian youth is relatively politically disengaged at this time, especially if we see low voter turnout. So if there is this sense of political apathy, individuals may be very unlikely to want to engage with the current political environment.
Well, thank you so much, Kristin. I'm sure we'll hear more from you as this continues to develop. For more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.